Okay. Thanks, everybody. Welcome to, it is the 11th of May. Welcome to Educative Seminar number 3 with the Australian Economics Olympiad. I am the host, Justin Virly, economics teacher from Brisbane up here in Queensland. And our guest today, we're very pleased to welcome Lewis South, New South Wales Treasurer, economist with the New South Wales Treasury. Sorry. Lewis is currently acting executive director of the macroeconomy division within the Economic Strategy and Productivity Group of New South Wales Treasury. The macroeconomy division undertakes analysis into short and long-term trends affecting the New South Wales macroeconomy, including demographic and sectoral trends to support both the New South Wales budget process, development across Treasury and government decision-making. Lewis's substantive position is as director of the Macroeconomic Analysis, Research, and Strategy MARS branch, which is one of the 3 branches that make up the macroeconomy division. In his substantive role, Lewis oversees a team of economists which analyze and report on developments in the New South Wales and Australian economies to inform and support policy development and decision-making across Treasury and government. The team is also responsible for developing forecasts on short-term developments in the macroeconomy, which underpin the New South Wales budget. All right, Lewis, thank you so much for joining us. Good to see you again, mate. How are you?
Very well, and my pleasure for having. Thanks for having me.
No worries.
I never got promoted there. I thought you were going to say I was a treasurer for a second then.
No worries. I apologize. It is, to be honest, it is a mouthful. It is a mouthful. There's a lot of different, there's a lot of language in there. There's a lot of words. I made a mental note. I probably did it to myself. Don't say treasurer. Don't say treasurer. Say treasury. And I probably created a problem myself.
I promise you, I'll probably mispronounce the word macroeconomic before this calls out.
That's okay. No worries. No worries at all. All right. So just for a bit of a rundown for our participants and for anybody who might be joining in, the way that this works, we do have the chat open for any students who are in attendance. And of course, this is being recorded and we will put it up on the AEO, the Australian Economics Olympiad YouTube channel as well. I myself am particularly looking forward to this as primarily an economics high school teacher. Primarily our syllabus, at least up in Queensland, focuses heavily on macroeconomics and economic policy, economic management. And it does seem like you have quite the experience in that. I am especially as well, particularly, and I might use this as a segue to our first question. Can you sort of, with macroeconomics, the high school classrooms usually are thinking about the federal budget, an overall economy. I would assume that the indicators and the theory, much of that is the same, but would you be able to kind of do a little bit of a compare and contrast from macroeconomics if you're looking at the federal level and macroeconomics if you're looking at the state level, being primarily interested in New South Wales?
Yeah, look, awesome question to start. Look, definitely we looked very much at the same indicators, and as a sub-state national government, obviously we and our economic conditions are driven a lot by forces that are outside of the New South Wales government's control. So, particularly, for example, when it comes to interest rates, the Reserve Bank of Australia is setting those. They impact the New South Wales economy as they impact other state economies. So we very much have to look at indicators for happening both within New South Wales, but we also have to have a very close eye about what is happening in the Australian economy and analyse that, because we need to have an idea for our forecasts around the future state of interest rates, as an example, because it will impact government borrowing costs, but will also impact the economic welfare of our citizens, but also the developments in the economy themselves. So there's quite a lot of similar things that we do look at. I guess where it comes to be a bit different is when we're thinking about the policy lens, we very much have to think about the more niche role that the New South Wales government has when it comes to macroeconomic policy. So particularly when it comes to sort of counter-cyclical policy. So we really have to understand that if you have any particular significant cycles that are occurring in the economy, the Reserve Bank has the predominant role of managing those cycles through counter-cyclical interest rate movements. The federal budget has much more significant levers at its control because it has control over your tax and welfare system. whereas the New South Wales state government, our levers are much more limited. So where our primary focus is, and this is kind of where my division sits as well within the New South Wales Treasury, is we don't just look at developments in the macroeconomy, but we're also very much focused at those kind of areas and those niches, those cohorts that kind of get left behind by federal policy. So we're very much interested in that demographic lens and interested in how different cohorts are affected by those big macroeconomic levers. So we have a whole branch that sits within the macroeconomy division that I'm currently the executive director for, that's called demographic and sectoral analysis. And they spend a lot of time looking at income inequality, how inflation is hitting different cohorts, how interest rate movements are hitting different cohorts. And that way, if there's any significant impacts that policy needs to be aware of, for example, the cost of living crisis example at the moment, policy can be very targeted towards impacting those cohorts. And that's really important because just as we don't have as big a array of levers at our control, we also don't have as much control over our income tax levers as we do with the Commonwealth. A lot of our revenue comes through specific tied grants or GST distributed revenue from the Commonwealth. So we have a lot less levers at our disposal. So we have to be a lot more targeted. We're a lot more focused on, I guess when it comes down to, you look at sort of federal financial relations, we're really focused on service delivery. So it's about making sure that health services are delivered where they needed to the standard that they're required. Education, of course, something that you're very much familiar with, making sure that we're having education that is being delivered where it's required. The students are getting the support they need. The teachers are getting the support they need. Transportation to make sure that people can move around efficiently. That's where the state government really lies.
Okay, so maybe just sort of confirm a little bit my understanding there. So does that mean that there wouldn't be as much of a back and forth conversation? Well, there would be conversations, but not so much the impact or the cause and the impact, I suppose, would be from the federal first, and then that's where you find out, in most simplistic terms, how much money or how much funding you have to work with as far as the federal budget going down to the state, going down to New South Wales, and then your division is largely, okay, how do we use this? Where do we direct this to? How does what the federal budget or federal spending has left us, how do we distribute that or allocate that? Is that sort of the right
look,
way to think of it?
That's certainly the way New South Wales Treasury works. My division is a bit separate to that. There's another division that looks at federal financial relations, and they specifically look at the grants that have been required and what we have to pay as part of that. But your kind of basic kind of linkages you're talking about, where the federal government is setting some overarching policies, they're providing some funding sources. There may be some tied grants that require New South Wales to provide funding, or a certain level of services that New South Wales government has to provide to get that funding. So Treasury very much looks at that and ensures that those agreements are the right ones for New South Wales, and that also they help to make sure that agencies are meeting those commitments. In terms of the macroeconomy division, so where I sit, what we are looking at doing is providing for everyone, for those teams' benefit, for the government's benefit, what is the underlying state of the economy at which they are delivering those services. And as a result, what's their own source revenue they're looking to generate out of that? Where are the areas that they need to target for their limited array of fiscal discretionary policy outside of those kind of service delivery areas?
Oh, excellent. Okay, thank you very much for clarifying. Yeah, fascinating, because again, most of the high school lens, at least up here in Queensland, is around, what is the treasurer doing, the federal treasurer, the budget. We're all very much aware that budget night is happening on Tuesday, but again, just in our high school syllabus, there isn't really much direct talk or analysis around, for example, the Queensland budget. That's not exactly an afterthought, but that's not something that we focus on as much in the high school level. Probably just a matter of timing and all that sort of stuff and things like that.
Look, I think it is a reflection of our Commonwealth-state relations, and the fact is the federal government has the big income tax levers. They've got a lot more at their disposal than what the state governments do. I should be clear not to really understate the role of state governments. I mean, that service delivery piece is absolutely crucial. You're thinking about driving the overall productive potential of the economy in the long run. So if you're thinking about the structural drivers of growth, quite a lot of that actually does come from what state governments do to incentivise people in the labour force through
Yep.
participation, by removing regulatory impediments and ensuring that the business environment is right so that businesses can invest and get the most productive potential out of their workforce. Of course, you improve the health of your workforce, you improve their education, then you'll improve their productive capacity of their
Yes.
lifetime. So there's quite a lot that New South Wales and the Queensland government actually does. But in terms of your year-to-year kind of movements that happen, that sort of swings in the cycle, which is why at a sort of school level, you really focus on those bigger institutions because they're in control a lot more of the year-to-year cyclical swings of the economy rather than what's happening on a structural long-term basis.
Yep. And I would imagine that staying with the federal levers is probably the best way to teach it at the very base high school level. The impact of injections on the circular flow of income. And, I think of all of the questions whenever the government is planning a big injection or a bit of stimulus or to fund this, the first question that teenagers usually bring up, which is a smart question, but a little bit of a simplistic question is, won't this just make inflation worse? And of course, it's much more complicated than that. It depends on what the injection is, who it's going to, where it's going to, and most of that is more local than just, $100 million to households for this. It kind of depends on where it's going.
But it is a really good starting point, though, Justin. Like, that's the way we frame it as a starting point within the New South Wales government. If we're advising the New South Wales Treasurer on policies to support cost of living, we're very much mindful of what impact that might have on spending in the economy and hence inflation. So, because if we try to ease the cost of living and all we do is injecting money into the economy and the Reserve Bank keeps interest rates high for longer, well, we've probably actually made cost of living worse. Anyone with a mortgage. So I think that basic concept is the same. And the way you kind of think about it, whether it's a national level, subnational level, in fact, even an international level, it is the same principles. And it's just you're moving down the gears.
Excellent.
To some degree,
Excellent. I'd love to be able to sort of drill down a little bit on your role specifically. Can you speak a little bit about the day-to-day? You did a great job of kind of looking at the big economic problems and the priorities that your department looks at. Can you sort of describe, we're largely speaking to high school students, many of which are going to be very high performing academically. And so they're choosing pathways. They are fortunate and hardworking enough that they can choose almost anything that they want to pursue. So they're thinking about, what should I, and with economics, that is one of the things where there might be a little bit of a lack of clarity as to when you have your Bachelor of Economics, when you pursue it higher up in academia, when you're working as an economist, most teenagers aren't sure what that person does, except for compared to, say, an engineer or an investment banker or an accountant or a nurse. So would you be able to, I guess, describe your day-to-day now, or perhaps thinking back to when you were starting out after uni, the work that an economist does?
Yeah, look, it's a quite interesting question. It's kind of hard to really distill down into one kind of simple answer. I think the thing I'd say about economics, and look, this is the same extent to some degree with other professions like engineering or doctor, all those sorts of things. At the end of the day, you're trying to improve outcomes for people. I think the difference between economics and a lot of the other professions is you have the capacity to actually make really profound difference on societal incomes and outcomes. And that's really unparalleled, because if you think about the reach that economics has, I mean, you don't even realize just how foundational it is across everything that we do now. It's just how ingrained economics is in terms of every decision people make during the day is based in some way, shape, or form of economics, even though people don't necessarily think about that. Even if you're driving on a highway, your decision about whether to change lanes is really game theory.
Yep,
if you
absolutely.
kind of think about it, which is the sort of thing you look at it at university economics. So it's really touches everything that you do. And so in terms of my day-to-day at New South Wales Treasury, in terms of my substantive role, it can really depend on the day. Like, I can come in with a fixed idea about, right, we're in a forecast round at the moment for our New South Wales state budget. We deliver that in June. You mentioned the Commonwealth budget. That's a focus for us this week. So I'll go in there with a view that I have to support my team that's looking at the forecasts. We might be looking at inflation a particular day, but then I might get a request that comes through from our industrial relations area that says there's a submission on wages that's about to go up to the expenditure review committee. We need to get your economic lens as to whether this is going to cause him to be inflationary or not. Are you comfortable with that? And so you need to pivot and be able to do that. So it's a really fast-paced environment where you constantly have a problem that you need to solve, or at least need to provide an economic lens to, whether it be, what impact will this have on inflation, or what impact will this particular policy measure have in terms of trying to improve outcomes in the housing sector, productivity, education, migration. It's a whole gamut of things that really reaches out and touches every facet of our day-to-day lives when you think about it. So I think economics is really unparalleled in that regard. An engineer will impact certain things. A doctor will obviously impact health, but an economist really has that capacity to impact the whole gamut of things that we experience, whether it be how efficiently we move around work, our work-life balance, the cost of our basic necessities, whether we can actually get a job, where we live, all those things really starting in with economics. So if you're interested in solving problems and trying to really make a genuine difference to societal outcomes, economics is certainly what it is for you. That's certainly why I do what I do.
Excellent. So that sounds like a lot of reading and a lot of research, a lot of statistical analysis, survey data to kind of analyze. Is there a lot of base level? The teenagers will often ask, like, do we have to be really good with Excel? Do we have to be really good with maths? Are we reading financial documents and making keynote presentations for stakeholders, things like that, like the whole kit and caboodle?
Yeah, look, it is. And look, if you look at the division that I sit in, and particularly the area that my substantive role in, which is the macroeconomic analysis research and strategy team, we deal a lot with ABS data, so Australian Bureau of Statistics. They will release labour force data, for example. We'll look at that data, generally in Excel. We'll draw some charts. We'll chart that data. We'll have a look at trends. We'll try and extract what is happening in an underlying sense, because the data might be very volatile. So we try to abstract from that volatility and try and actually capture what is the essence of the narrative about what is happening. So we're analysing data. We're looking at it in with Excel. We're manipulating the data. And then we're trying to distill a key narrative that we can very quickly and simply distill to across Treasury and across government. And, I'm talking to a lot of economists on this call, or people who are studying economics. Some of our stakeholders have very limited understanding of economics.
Yes.
Yes. So we have to be able to do that in such a way that it's accessible for a broad range of stakeholders. So, and so on a day-to-day basis, my team will, depending on data that's released, they will analyse that data. They release a thing called a snapshot that goes right across New South Wales government. So the Premier will see that, the Treasurer will see it, his office will see it, key stakeholders across the Premier's department and New South Wales Treasury will see that. It gives us our spin about what we're thinking. While they're doing that, my forecast team are analysing that data to see what it means for future growth.
Yep.
We're having to look to see if there's any implications for interest rates, and hence what impact they might have on government interest expenses. We'll then present that data if we need to stakeholders, and it might be a different presentation we'll do for our revenue forecasting team, because they're very economic literate, focused on very specific things, to our forecasts that we'll provide to the Treasurer, which might be a much higher level, really focusing on what the key things that he needs to be aware of. So what's the impact going to be on housing supply? What's the impact going to be on the interest rate? What's the impact on unemployment? The things that he might be particularly focused on, or any other outcomes he might be particularly focused on. And then while that's all sort of happening, we're also trying to progress sort of research into some of the longer term trends. So if we look at the division that I sit in, and sort of step back out, so we've got my substantive team, that Mars team that does all that work. There's another team that's really focusing on 40-year plus horizon. So they're looking at, well, what's the impact of climate change and the net transition going to have on the structure of the economy, on employment participation outcomes, on productivity, on economic welfare by 2060. What's the impact of any government policies today going to be on the fiscal position in 40 years' time? Because we have to be mindful that we don't want to make decisions now that are going to have intergenerational inequality kind of issues as well. They'll look at things about what the aging population is going to do in terms of increasing health expenditure, in terms of what we need to do in terms of health outcomes. And then we've got another team that's, as I said, the demographic sectoral analysis team. They're looking at, well, what do these trends all mean for income or wealth inequality? Where are the cohorts that need support? They'll look at specific areas like, well, what impact is, this is a project that the team's looking at the moment, what is the economic impact of domestic violence? It's in Australia. Wow. It's obviously a very topical issue at the moment with quite rightly so. It's obviously terrible what we're seeing at the moment happening in Australia. A key part of trying to support that is also understanding the economics of it. Because, if you look at what's happening, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are in abusive relationships that can't leave those relationships because they lack that economic security. So understanding the economic costs of this is really important to try to kind of make sure we're generating the solutions to support those people. So it's a really broad gamut. It's anything, any sort of economic problem you can kind of think of. My division is probably looking at it. In some way, shape, or form.
That's definitely one of the themes that a lot of us have in our classrooms is that's one of the most exciting and interesting, but then also perhaps the most challenging, especially when we're just talking about the students' exams and end of year external exams, that you can never really predict what type. There's an infinite amount of economic situations or economic policies that the end of year exam makers can throw at you. So So from the teenager perspective, it really is integral not to just memorize models and memorize facts, but to really understand the nuts and bolts and the causes and the impacts. I'd like to step back a little bit. Well, I suppose pivot to, since we were speaking about such a wide gamut of issues and topics, is there anything in particular you can think of that's especially unique or surprising work or research that you've come across recently, or something that's stuck with you for a very long time, either academically or through your professional work, like any really unique problem that kind of stood out? You're like, you know what, I never really thought about this as being an economic problem, or this really knocked us back a few years ago, or something like that. Any especially unique type of economic problem?
Look, I might broaden it if I can, and say not so much a problem, but a situation we found ourselves in. Without doubt, it was the COVID period.
Yes.
Because obviously that was in essence a health situation, but it was a health situation that ended up having very real and very significant impacts on the macroeconomy, and then also for individuals. And what was really interesting about that was, we've had pandemics before, back in the early 20th century, but there was no one alive today that had lived through that experience, and they hadn't lived through it in an experience of a degree of a world that was as connected as it is today, both physically through airline travel, but also in terms of the economy with global production chains. So, all that theory that we've been, using to drive efficiencies and productivity and wealth in our economy through, focusing on comparative advantage and economies of scale, and, outsourcing production to China with cheap labor and importing those cheap goods, and then exporting our resources to help support that, and the wealth we were generating as a society. Suddenly that all got flipped on its head, because production chains meant we couldn't build houses because we couldn't get the materials, or the costs of the materials that we required for our own health system was really significantly impaired. We stopped having a flow of people, which meant we stopped having those skills. So we had to generate those skills from our own workforce. And so it was really just this completely unprecedented situation, and there was no textbook, no playbook that you could rely on. And I was kind of fortunate, I guess, for want of a better term. I started with Treasury basically as COVID was kicking off, so in early April of 2020. And if you think back to at that time, like when it first broke, when we went into lockdown, we were told 6 months lockdown. We were told that history says that you've never generated a vaccine within 5 years of a virus being emerging. So there was this prospect of this thing being around and having profound impacts on the macroeconomy for a very, very long period of time. And so we were having to really really work on the fly. It was a really high pressure, fast changing environment. You come into work and there'd be a new development, a new health order, and you'd have to that day, advise on what's the economic impact of that health order. What should the government do as a result of that? When we went through the second lockdown, there was really significant changes to Commonwealth-state relations because the Commonwealth didn't want everyone to go into lockdown, so they were providing the income support through to businesses. So the state governments had to stand that support up. And so we had to really look about what would the economy look like in the absence of that support. Should the state government do these things? These are questions that no one ever had grappled with and no one thought we'd ever have to grapple with, and had such profound impacts on the economy. If we'd gotten these things wrong, we were talking about significant weakness in our economy for long periods of time. I mean, you only have to look at places like the UK where they've only just getting back to the level of activity that they had in 2019. Whereas because of the support that was provided and because we did so well to manage the health situation and the economy at the time, we rebounded quite sharply. But of course, it meant that we now have other problems as a result of that. In the high inflation you're seeing at the moment, issues in the construction sector with insolvencies are all byproducts of that. So I think really it was really a lesson one-on-one of practical economics and again, how profound it was. It was quite an amazing time. And I guess it really kind of makes that adage quite clear that I'll remember, which is, economists have their biggest value when there's a crisis on. It's when you can then step back into that discipline when everyone else is getting undisciplined. It's that discipline that economics can kind of provide that grounding for really good policy outcomes.
Yep.
And that's what we were able to achieve by and large through that. And that meant that you could focus on dealing with the health crisis. Because we could look after the economy at the same time. So I think if you look at a situation, I think that's a big one. If you're looking at sort of research at the moment, look, one of the big areas at the moment we're looking at is productivity. I think there's a lot of interesting work now around what's called additive productivity. So it's this notion that productivity isn't a shock that has the same growth rate over time that accumulates, but rather it's a decaying impact over time on its own growth. So there's a lot of work on that. And then thinking about the intersection that we'll have on AI, there's quite a lot of research around there at the moment. I think right now, the area that I'm particularly interested in is around wealth inequality. I think that's a really important part from a societal viewpoint and getting a lot more focus out there in the literature now through universities and other think tanks like Grattan and the like. So they're probably some of the starting points, I'd say, but there's so much.
Yes, absolutely.
That we're seeing,
absolutely. I imagine I'd be able to predict that the answer to this next question. I can tell that you really have a passion for macroeconomics and an interest, but can you speak on why or how you ended up with the large focus on macroeconomics as opposed to micro? Do you have any experience in the academically, professionally, where you were focusing primarily on microeconomics, smaller markets, local markets, individual markets, as opposed to the entire economy? So why macroeconomics is your focus?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. Look, I did microeconomics at university and did pretty well at it. In fact, it was one of the ones I actually topped a university course on, was my third year microeconomics. But I enjoyed economics at high school. That's what got my passion going. And when I was at high school, and I should be careful because it's giving away my age, but the Cold War was just ending. This is the very early 1990s. We had very, very high inflation, very high interest rates. We were going through the recession that Paul Keating said we had to have. The RBA didn't really have a cohesive policy sort of focus like it does now on inflation. That came 2 years after.
Yeah, that would have been before they had the target rate.
Correct. Right? There are a lot of big macro problems out there, and I wanted to be a part of that. I love solving problems. I love doing puzzles when I was young. So I went to uni and I started to do it, and I was actually toying with being a lawyer and hated the law, so focused on the economics. And then in my honours degree, I studied in quite great detail Keynes's general theory. And that was kind of it for me. I then did a thesis on gender inequality in the workplace, particularly around the so-called glass ceiling, which unfortunately is still an issue today. Interestingly, a lot of the things that I proposed at the time are things that policymakers are grappling with implementing now. So
Yeah.
expanding childcare outcomes is a great example of that. These were things I kind of mentioned 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So I could see then how practical solutions can make a big difference to outcomes that everyone experiences in their daily lives. So like I wanted to be a part of that, and I wanted
Yeah.
to be part of as big a picture of that as I possibly could. So
Mm-hmm.
so my focus was macro from that end, and then I was very fortunate to kind of go to an interview with the Reserve Bank, and kind of my passion for it came across, and got offered a role, and the rest is
Excellent.
history, as they say.
Excellent. Excellent. Um, for for our high school audience, who is, again, I sort of referenced before, that most of the students who sign up to the Olympiad, they're quite high performing academically. They can choose any top performing, any top field. At least that's making up their preference list. They're likely going to have pretty high ATARs and all that sort of stuff. So they have a lot of choices in front of them, and they're also even going to be excellent students. So they'll probably say that it all interests them, that they like the idea of being a physicist, they like the idea of being a doctor, they enjoy economics, all of that sort of stuff. So do you have any advice, I suppose, as to how a student who has that many choices in front of them, how they might know that economics is the thing that would fulfill them, or economics is the thing that they should roll the dice on? I like to frame this question in the following way. You know that you should pursue a career in economics if blank.
Yeah. If you like solving problems and you want to make a real difference to the outcomes for society as a whole,
Mm,
like a real genuine difference, I just, and again, not undermining those other fields, they can absolutely have very big, important impacts on people's lives. But if you want to make a difference to the greatest number of people's lives, to the absolute um,
mm,
widest extent as
yeah,
possible,
yeah,
you become an economist.
yeah.
It's everything the Reserve Bank does, every decision it makes, whether it be to hold, to raise, to cut, impacts every single part of the Australian economy.
Mm-hmm.
Right down to your producers of wheat, because it
Yeah.
will help determine what the exchange rate they're going to get,
Mm,
the price they're going to get for their products. To the people who have a mortgage,
mm-hmm.
to retirees who are relying on interest income.
Yeah,
It's everywhere.
yeah, yeah,
So for me, that's what it comes down to. If you love solving problems and you want to make a difference, then you get into economics. That's kind of what my
yeah,
story has been. Yeah.
yeah, yep. I love that. That statement of impacting the greatest number of people, the greatest number of people. I think that is something that might be different from the other fields that might work more hands-on, one-on-one, or have a specific project that a building gets built, or something like that. But even just our recent policies, our recent federal policies that are probably going to be detailed more in the budget, the changing to the hex indexation, or the prac payments for the placement university payments for nurses and those doing, I think, nursing, teaching, and social work degrees, that there's going to be a little bit of income for them while they're on a 10-week placement and things like that. Just a number of, whether or not you agree or disagree, or are on the pro side or the con side, no one would argue that that is a very impactful decision, and the teams that are involved in cooking up that type of plan and implementing it, the number of people that those policies would impact, I don't think can be argued.
And you've got to think about the flow-on effects of some of those things.
Yes.
Take that one around the nurses, getting paid for that. That might mean that there's that one person who was kind of deciding between being a health practitioner or not. They
Mm,
now make the decision to be a health practitioner, and that could help improve the health outcomes for thousands of people.
yep.
And that has
Yep.
a really profound impact then on their family's well-being and the
Yep.
opportunities of their children.
Yep.
So the flow and effects, intergenerational, can be
Mm-hmm.
massive for some of these things.
Yep.
Um, every day I go into work and I'm like, okay, how am I going to actually help? The outcomes for the people of New South Wales, and there'll be something that happens where I can say that's going to have an impact, whether it be a
Mm,
discussion we're having on housing policy, whether it's a discussion on industrial relations policy and wages, and
mm,
looking at inflation. whether it be thinking about skills and migration and how do we support education and health outcomes to be improved. Like every discussion we're having ends up having an impact on the population in some way, shape, or form. It is really without precedent, I think, as a profession, to have such a wide scope.
Yep. Yep. Excellent. Fantastic. All right. I do have a couple of questions coming in from students in the chat. So thank you for that. It is a common question. I think students just like asking. This is something that plays up on their minds when they're picking their university preferences and things like that. There is a big concern around the level of math skill that someone who might love economics, they love unpacking policies, they love the modeling and the charts and things like that, but they might be at least not terrific at at mathematics. Maybe they're average or slightly above average, or maybe some are even it's definitely a point of contention and a point of struggle. So how if so how much maths are involved, or if there is a high school student who loves economics but maths is not their strong suit, what would your insights be for them?
Look, it certainly can help if you are quantitatively minded.
Okay.
There's no question about that. But there's large fields of economists, and if you look within Treasury, 3/4 of Treasury are probably made up of people who aren't particularly very well enumerated.
Okay.
So,
Good.
and they have quite a large amount of remit and influence around policy. So, what is more important, really, at the end of the day, and I consider myself in this bucket. If it comes to Excel skills, as an example, my math skills is pretty good. I have to say, but if it comes to like advanced Excel skills, I'm terrible at using Excel. I'm absolutely abysmal. The team that I have are very good, but I'm absolutely abysmal. But what's much more important is that way of thinking.
Yeah.
It's that way of understanding how a movement in policy here will have this outcome and this outcome, and trying to judge between what the outcome you're trying to achieve versus the unintended consequences as well, and then trying to weigh those up and trying to figure out how you can reduce those unintended consequences to get the outcome that you want by changing the mixture of policy. You don't have to be particularly strong quantitatively to be able to do that. What you have to be able to do is understand the framework of how an economy works. I was very fortunate to work at the Reserve Bank, and New South Wales Treasury is the same. And that's when I learned to be an economist. It wasn't, and no offense to the university courses, they teach you very good theory, but it was when you stepped out and you saw how things happened in practice that you really understood, right, if interest rates move here, it has this impact on these people, and they will spend this, which will then have this impact on here, which will have this impact on inflation. So you don't have to be particularly strong quantitatively to be able to do that, but you have to have that way of thinking about, and that way of thinking about frameworks and processes is probably more important, which is why you have a lot of people who do engineering who become economists.
Yep. That's right.
Because it's a very similar way of thinking.
Yep.
It is about problem solving, and it's about understanding those linkages and those relationships that really matter. So look, it helps, without a doubt, in particular fields, particularly if you're in an area that does a lot of quantitative econometric kind of work, like my team. I've got one of my teams that does that. But then my demographic and sectoral analysis team aren't particularly quant skilled. They're much more focused on the policy side of things, on those frameworks about how these things and we'll focus on unintended consequences. So they're okay mathematically, but they're not. It's not their strong suit. So there's definitely a career for those sorts of people. You don't have to be great at maths. And it just depends on what you want to do. And that's the great thing about economics. There's so many different fields you can get into with it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Great answer. And I'm overjoyed that is sort of what I tell the students, that, that it obviously does help if you're really, really good at maths, but if you're a math genius, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a better economist. And weakness in maths is definitely not a reason to be turned off of the degree. There are plenty of pathways where, no, if you want to do that, you really do need to be good at maths, but economics is not one of them.
And if you want to be good at microeconomics and policy, it's really good to be a macroeconomist first,
Okay.
because again, it's that way of thinking, it's that framework.
Yes.
And that understanding relationships and linkages,
Yeah.
that's what economics does, and it helps you with a lot of other things. As I said, you think about people driving cars on a road. It's game theory. So you think about how you design transport networks.
Hmm. Okay.
There's
Yep.
economics behind that.
Yep.
So
Yep.
yeah,
Excellent. Fantastic. Okay. One more student question, another common one. Can you speak? This one's about pay and job prospects. Of course, it's reasonable as to why 16, 17-year-olds would, be thinking, weighing those up. So can you speak a little bit about, you finish with your Bachelor of Economics or whatever the program might be called. You've done all the right things in uni. You have a combination of good grades and good internship work experience, volunteer work, the student union and clubs and things like that. How competitive is it for new grads? And could that, would obviously sparing the details, I suppose, the compensation, the salary packages, things should, yeah, I suppose you know where I'm going, like how
yeah,
competitive the field would be. What could the students expect or look forward to, or something if they did choose this pathway?
yeah. Look, it really depends on what you really want to focus on in your interest. Because there's multi-disciplines you can look at. So, in terms of being a pure economist, obviously you've got institutions like the Reserve Bank, Commonwealth, New South Wales Treasury. There's a lot of other private banks that
Mm,
have economist teams as well. They're very foundational, again, because that kind of understanding about what interest rates are going to do, really important if you're a
yep,
commercial bank
yep,
who is looking to lend a lot of money through to mortgages. You need to understand what the risks are involved in that, and understand interest rates. So all of these banks have economics teams, and they're fairly well resourced as well. But then if you look at private banks, if you look at investment banks, if you look at superannuation, anywhere in finance, there's a
mm,
huge amount of required for economic skills. If you look at my career as an example, I started at Reserve Bank, very much at that big macro focus, significant sort of national institution. I then started working after that at Macquarie Bank for a few years in their funds
mm,
management arm.
mm-hmm,
And I was advising traders on
yep,
sometimes very short term things. It's like, okay, I think this next inflation report is going to surprise to the high side. So people's markets' expectations for interest rates will go up, and the bond traders would take 1 day positions to try and
wow,
improve the outcomes for the superannuation clients. So you can have things like that. And then when I went to ANZ, I was actually managing people's superannuation portfolios.
yeah, yep,
So I was actually running tactical asset allocation, so on all of ANZ Wealth superannuation offerings. So there's so many different fields
mm,
that economics can actually get into.
yeah,
You
yep,
don't have to be a pure economist.
mm,
You can get into finance, you can get in
yep,
commercial banking, you can get into private banking, you can
mm-hmm,
get into superannuation, or you can be an economist and really deal with a lot of those big picture problems. So, and look, it's a rewarding career financially.
yeah,
They are in demand, particularly if
yeah,
you the private sector, but even the public sector. They're reasonably well paid
mm,
positions.
excellent.
Because they have such a vast impact.
Yep. Good, good, good. So job prospects are strong, everybody. Yeah, no need to worry about that. If you're good, you'll be able to find a place where you can make a really big impact, and get paid reasonably well to do so.
That's right.
Yep, excellent. Good, good. All right. That's it for the student questions. I have one more that I like to ask everybody that we interview, meant to be a bit of either a fun or a thought-provoking one to finish up, which is if you were, Lewis, the federal treasurer, um, what is one policy or issue you think you would like to address first? This does not necessarily have to be what do you think is the biggest problem facing our economy. It could be something that you think we've ignored for far too long, so we should start looking at this, or this is the one that we could fix easiest, like right away, so we should just tick that box right away. What's one policy or issue you think you would look at first if you're the federal treasurer, Lewis?
Right. Okay. Can I maybe scale it back to the New South Wales Treasurer?
Sure, absolutely.
Is that okay? Yeah.
Yep,
Cool.
yep.
Really good question. Only because I kind of think about this a lot more as a New South Wales
No, no,
treasurer,
that's great.
and
That is
kind of
great.
where my head's at. So, look, if I was a federal treasurer, I'd try and fix our tax system, to be honest with you.
Okay.
But I'm just not sure that's actually possible. But so I will leave that one alone,
Okay.
and we'll go back to New South Wales treasurer. I think right now I'd have to say it's housing.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of our absolute basic needs. It's so fundamental to society.
Mm.
Adequate, accessible housing is so fundamental to a person's health and well-being, and it actually is really necessary if you're going to ensure that everyone can make the most of their skills and abilities, which in turn impacts the productive capacity of the economy as a
Yeah.
whole. So,
Yeah.
and there's no question at the moment, like we've got a housing crisis. There's no question about that. I don't think anyone shies away from that. And there's a lot of that at the moment that reflects just the current state of the economic cycle. But there's quite clearly a structural issue as well. So my team's actually doing a lot of work at this at the moment. One of the things that we've looked at is what's the elasticity? So how responsive is housing supply in New South Wales to changes in house prices at the moment? Because house prices are going up, and we're not
Yeah.
building more homes.
Yes.
And so housing affordability is becoming worse and worse and worse. So
Yeah.
we've had a look at this, and what we found was that the sensitivity of housing supply in New South Wales to house prices in New South Wales is only about a third of that for the rest of Australia.
Also, it's more inelastic.
Correct.
Supply is more inelastic in New South Wales than the rest of Australia. Is that
Correct.
correct?
Yeah,
Yeah.
by quite some margin. So, and you're seeing this with home ownership rates, like especially amongst people under the age of 45, and this is having really profound intergenerational equity and wealth effects. So, look, that sort of tells us there's clearly some structural issue with our system that needs fixing.
Mm.
So, for me, we need to look at the planning system really long and hard. We need to address the so-called NIMBYism that's out there because we need to increase housing density in those places where people want to live. We can't just keep the urban sprawl going because that
Yeah.
creates a lot of problems in terms of transportation. Of course, it impacts
Mm.
wealth and equality of well-being as well because you have to spend more time traveling to where your jobs are.
Yeah.
And for me as well, and again, this debate that's out there at the moment on domestic violence that's front and center at the moment. For me, we need to do a lot on housing security, not just on housing affordability.
Okay.
So, you have to understand that even at the top, we only had 72% of our population that were homeowners.
Hmm.
So, there's about 30% that are in the rental market. They're forced in the rental market for whatever reason. They're just never able to afford the home that they want to live in. And it's particularly important for families who are dealing with domestic violence. As I said
Mm.
before, there's so many women and children who are suffering in abusive relationships at the moment because they just don't feel like they can leave because they don't have that security of having a place to go that
Mm.
they can afford, that they know they won't get kicked out or in 6 or 12 months' time because that property might get sold and
Mm.
someone else wants to live in it, or there might be a rent increase and they can't afford it anymore. So housing is so fundamental to that debate, in my opinion. So, and again, because it's just such a basic need, and clearly there's a structural problem there from the
Mm.
analysis, I'd say that's probably the one that I'd turn my attention to. I'd really try and kick a hornet's nest open, if you like, on particularly addressing that NIMBYism and the planning system to see if we can
Yes.
to get things moving a little bit.
Yeah. Yep. Excellent. Yeah, I do. Where we live, we're fortunate that there's numerous. We have a young child, so the closeness to parks and playgrounds is obviously an important thing to us. Um, we're fortunate to have numerous small playgrounds in walking distance to our home, and around one of them in particular, there's a few houses that have signs, very old signs. They look like they might have been up there for decades or longer, that almost exactly say save our park, don't let them build housing here.
Yeah,
Uh, and you obviously, as anybody, but especially as an economist, you understand where they're coming from. It is wonderful to have a house that backs onto the playground, but that's almost exactly you don't own that park. That it's quite reasonable that resource could be used for housing or something. Obviously, it's more complicated than what that sign says, but that is the thought process that goes through my mind every time I see save this park, save the blocks of land, all of this sort of stuff, I think, oh, it's a complicated problem. As you say, the planning issues, who gets to make those decisions, the stakeholders, and the competing interests, really, the competing interests that people have.
It is such a microcosm of basic economics and the economic
Yes.
problem, right?
Yeah,
Which is too many needs and not enough resources.
that's it. Absolutely.
And that's housing one, in a nutshell.
Yeah,
Whether it be the
absolutely.
parkland, the transportation infrastructure that's
Yep.
required,
Yep.
water,
Yep.
electricity, all of those utilities that are required as part of it. But the fact is, we have to house people. If the shoe was under the foot, you can imagine if you weren't the person who owned that house and you were struggling to find somewhere, you would look at that sign and have a very different lens on it
Yes. Oh,
than if you were the
100%.
person who
Yep.
already lived there. So I think
Yep.
that is one of those basic problems that, again, you've got to take, as you said, it's a complex problem. It's not easily solved. It hasn't been solved in 3 decades.
No. No.
Um, so that's where I'd start
Yep.
for
And
sure.
it's such a fascinating one, and I try to maintain optimism, but I can easily understand why people might feel like there's nothing that can be done. I just, you could probably tell by my accent, I'm not from Australia originally. I'm from Canada. We just recently got back on an overseas trip over Christmas. And it's been a very long time since I've been there prior. And of course, my family over there, cost of living, housing affordability, um, like rental prices, all of that sort of stuff is not the same as ours, but they're having the same types of problems. They're complaining about the same things, but they have a very different, at least housing market.
Yeah,
They don't really have the negative gearing isn't really it's not really a mechanism there. They have much longer fixed mortgage rates, averaging 5 to 10 years. So the interest rate changes aren't as impactful on the short term, on an immediate basis as us. I believe they have different rates of things like social housing and all that sort of stuff. Not better, not worse. Just it's totally a different market the way that it operates, but they have housing is going up so much. People can't afford their electricity or their bills. And it's easy to see why it would make a lot of people just why everybody's mad. Uh, but and all because of what's happening, but almost just very, very much discouraged because it doesn't seem like anyone, like no one can point to a country or a city that it's like, oh, they solved it. We should do what they do because
yeah.
they're all the 22-year-olds are buying a house, no problem there. That's not yeah, it's fascinating.
It is, and look, there's so many different ways in which it's done. Like if you go to Germany as an example, like home ownership rates are significantly lower. They have
Yeah,
a really
yeah.
well-established system, and it's come from that sort of feudal system that they had back in way way back. So all the land was owned by a very few number of people. So they have a lot of long-term rental market.
Mm,
Very different. And again, but you look at housing in Australia because of our tax system as a way in
yes.
which you can improve your wealth. So
Yep. Yep.
people don't want to go down that. So there's a lot to unpack, and I like your characterization before, Justin. That they're not better, they're not necessarily they're different, and we have our own values in Australia around home ownership. It has a
Mm,
very unique part of the Australian lexicon.
yep.
That I want to own a home with the quarter acre block that
Yeah, that's it. Yep.
with the swings in the backyard for the kids and the park nearby, all those things that you
Mm,
talked about. And we can't deliver on that at the moment for such a large number of people. So we have to start thinking about it differently, um,
mm,
but still have to do it in the construct of what people want in Australia from housing,
yep. Yep.
not just what they need. So, yeah, it's fascinating, absolutely
Yes.
fascinating.
Yes. Excellent. Well, I believe we should let you go now, Lewis. This has been excellent. I've really enjoyed this chat. I feel like I could ask you questions and pick your brain for hours and hours on end. Thank you so much on behalf of our students and the Olympiad. Um,
My
yeah,
pleasure. Yeah,
really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
no, my
Um,
and good luck to everyone as well. Really enjoyed being a part of this, and wish everyone all the best in the Olympiad as well.
Wonderful. Excellent. So I think I might let you go, Lewis. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, you take care, mate. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Lewis.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Yep. Now take care. Okay, everybody. That is it for this seminar. Very, very quickly, we have our last educative seminar coming up in 2 weeks' time on the 25th of May. Our guest then, I think this is the first time that I've remembered to like lead into the next one. Our guest on the 25th of May is going to be Alex Simons, who is an economist and high school economics teacher as well, working with the Reserve Bank of Australia. So we will get another touch of macroeconomics, probably very great insights on high school syllabi and curriculum content and Olympiad tips and tricks and things like that. So I think that is it. Thanks very much, everybody. If you have nothing else, Gray, I think we can sign off.
Yeah, nothing else from me. If you have any questions about the Australian Economics Olympiad, feel free to shoot them through, or you can email us at support@aeo.org.au. Thank you so much, Justin. It was a really interesting conversation.
Thanks, Ray. You take care. Bye.
Thanks.